Before her name became synonymous with one of America's most haunting true crime cases, Laci Denise Peterson was a living, breathing woman with a future she was counting down to day by day, kick by kick, heartbeat by heartbeat. At just 27 years old, Laci was 8 months pregnant and deeply immersed in the final stretch of her first pregnancy. Her life revolved around anticipation. Baby clothes folded and refolded. A nursery waiting to be filled with sound. A name already chosen, Connor, spoken aloud as if saying it enough times could make the future arrive faster. Laci lived in Modesto, California, a quiet, suburban city where neighbors noticed routines and holidays passed slowly. She worked as a substitute teacher, a job that reflected her nurturing nature and patience. Friends and family described her as warm, organized, and deeply family-oriented. Someone who remembered birthdays, checked in often, and showed up when it mattered. Pregnancy had only amplified those traits. She spoke often about becoming a mother, about how everything in her life now revolved around protecting the tiny life growing inside her. Her marriage to Scott Peterson appeared, at least outwardly, stable. They had met years earlier, married young, and built what looked like a conventional life. Scott worked in fertilizer sales. Laci managed a home and prepared for motherhood. To outsiders, they were the image of an expectant couple approaching a milestone together. But beneath that image, there were fault lines no one could yet see. As Christmas approached in 2002, Laci was nearing her due date. She was advised by doctors to take it easy. Long walks were discouraged. Fatigue came easily. Every movement was deliberate, careful. Because she wasn't moving for one anymore, she was moving for two. That Christmas would never come. What makes this case so chilling is not only what happened to Laci, but who she was just before everything stopped. She was not reckless. She was not isolated. She was not someone who simply vanished without notice. She was heavily pregnant, deeply loved, and anchored to routines that made disappearance unthinkable. And yet within hours, Laci Peterson would be gone. No goodbye, no struggle witnessed, no explanation, only a quiet house and a future that would never arrive. When you strip away the headlines, the trials, and the debates, what remains at the center of the story is a woman who trusted the life she was building, and a child who never took his first breath. And that is what makes what comes next so unsettling. Christmas Eve morning in Modesto, California, began quietly, almost deceptively ordinary. The house on Covina Avenue showed no signs of distress, just a heavily pregnant woman preparing for what should have been a calm holiday at home. According to Scott Peterson, Laci woke up that morning and planned to do light housework. He later told investigators that she intended to take the family dog, Mackenzie, for a short walk around the neighborhood before settling in for the day. At 8 months pregnant, long walks were discouraged, but a brief stroll close to home seemed harmless. Scott said he left the house later that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, nearly 90 miles away. He claimed Laci was still alive when he left. By early evening, when Scott returned home, Laci was gone. Her absence was immediately troubling, not because she was unreachable, but because everything she would normally take with her was still inside the house. Her purse sat untouched. Her car remained in the driveway. Her shoes were still there. There was no pack bag, no note, no indication she had planned to go anywhere. The dog, however, was found wandering outside, leash still attached, and was returned by a neighbor. The leash detail would become one of the most haunting symbols of the case. A dog back home, without its owner. At 5:47 p.m., Scott Peterson called 911 to report his wife missing. The timing mattered. The details mattered. Every word mattered. Police arrived at what appeared to be a normal home frozen in time. Christmas decorations were up. The kitchen showed signs of light activity. The scene felt wrong, not chaotic, but eerily still, as if life had been interrupted mid-sentence. As news spread, concern turned into alarm. A heavily pregnant woman does not simply disappear on foot on Christmas Eve without taking her belongings. Family members immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. By nightfall, search teams flooded the area. Neighbors retraced walking routes. Officers combed parks, sidewalks, and nearby fields. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers held flashlights, calling Laci's name into the darkness. But there was no response. No footprints leading away. No witnesses who saw her walking. No sightings that could be confirmed. As hours turned into days, the silence grew heavier. Media vans arrived. Candlelight vigils were held. Flyers bearing Laci's smiling face and visibly pregnant belly appeared on street corners and storefronts. Behind the scenes, investigators began to take a harder look at the timeline and at Scott Peterson's account of the day. Where exactly had Laci gone? Why had no one seen her? And how did a woman so close to giving birth vanish without leaving a trace? What began as a missing person case was slowly, quietly shifting into something far darker. Because in cases like this, the first 24 hours often tell the most important story. And the story Christmas Eve was beginning to tell did not point toward a walk gone wrong. It pointed inward, toward the home she never came back to. By the morning after Christmas, the search for Laci Peterson had transformed from a local concern into a full-scale emergency. Volunteers poured into Modesto by the hundreds, then thousands. Law enforcement expanded the search radius quickly because the circumstances demanded it. Pregnant women do not vanish easily, not without help, not without reason. Investigators began reconstructing Laci's final known hours with clinical precision. Neighbors were questioned repeatedly. Surveillance footage was reviewed. Tips flooded in, some hopeful, many disturbing, most leading nowhere. Despite the massive effort, no confirmed sightings of Laci after Scott left the house could be verified. Attention inevitably turned to Scott Peterson. The detail raised eyebrows. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Investigators uncovered that Scott had been involved in an extramarital affair with a woman named Amber Fry. What made this discovery especially chilling was not just the affair itself, but its timing. Scott had told Amber that he had lost his wife and that this would be his first Christmas without her. He said this before Laci disappeared. When Amber realized the man she was dating was at the center of a national missing person search, she went to police. Her cooperation will become one of the most damning elements of the case. Phone calls between her and Scott were recorded, calls in which Scott spoke calmly, sometimes romantically, while standing at vigils for his missing, pregnant wife. To investigators and the public alike, the contrast was unsettling. The search continued, but now it had a shadow. While teams scoured rivers and fields, detectives quietly shifted focus from rescue to reconstruction. They began asking questions no one wanted to ask out loud yet. Was Laci ever on that walk? Was she alive when Scott left the house? And if not, where had she gone? Public sympathy slowly fractured. Where once there had been hope, now there was unease. Scott's demeanor, measured, controlled, almost attached, became a subject of constant scrutiny. Every interview, every facial expression, every pause was analyzed. Still, there was no physical evidence. No blood, no weapon, no crime scene. Just a woman who had vanished, and a husband whose story no longer sat right. As winter turned toward spring, the search for Laci Peterson entered its most devastating phase. Because what was about to surface would not be a rescue. It would be a discovery that answered some questions, and open wounds that would never fully close. By April 2003, hope had thinned to something fragile and unspoken. For months had passed since Laci Peterson vanished, and despite relentless searching, she remained missing. The case had begun to drift into that grim category investigators know too well, where answers no longer come from rescue, but from recovery. Then, on April 13th, the silence broke. A man walking his dog along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, not far from the Berkeley Marina, noticed something unnatural resting against the mudflats. At first glance, it did not immediately register as human, just a pale, waterlogged shape partially buried by tide and debris. But as he moved closer, the truth became unmistakable. It was the body of a male fetus. The discovery was horrifying on its own, but what followed made it devastating. The next day, less than a mile away, searchers found a female torso, badly decomposed, missing its head and limbs. The water had stripped away much of what once made the body recognizable, but investigators already feared what DNA would confirm. The remains were Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The condition of the bodies told a grim story. Months in the cold, shifting tides had erased critical evidence. Soft tissue was gone. Bones were exposed. There were no clear wounds that could definitively establish how Laci had died. The medical examiner could not determine a precise cause of death, not because violence was absent, but because the water had taken too much with it. Yet the location of the remains mattered. They surfaced in the same bay where Scott Peterson said he had gone fishing on Christmas Eve. To investigators, this was no coincidence. It was a geographic echo of Scott's own words. The prosecution would later argue that Laci's body, weighted down, had remained submerged for months until tides and currents finally returned her to the surface. For Laci's family, the discovery was shattering. The uncertainty was over, but the truth they received was unbearable. There would be no Christmas miracle, no homecoming, no baby cries, just the confirmation that both mother and child were gone. Public reaction was immediate and visceral. Vigils turned into memorials. Media coverage intensified overnight, and the question that had lingered since December now pressed forward with crushing force. Who put her there? Investigators now worked backward from the bay, reconstructing tides, timelines, and movements. They examined Scott Peterson's boat. They analyzed his purchases, including materials used to make homemade concrete anchors. They scrutinized every inconsistency in his account of that day. Still, the case remained largely circumstantial. No witnesses saw Laci being taken. No blood was found at the house. No confession was made. But the image of a pregnant woman and her unborn child surfacing near the place her husband claimed to be fishing would become one of the most haunting visuals in modern true crime history. The search for Laci was over. The search for justice had just begun. With Laci and Connor finally recovered, the case shifted from searching to building a narrative of how and by whom they died. There was no dramatic crime scene to return to, no bloodstains to photograph, no weapon to hold up in court. What prosecutors had instead was a web of circumstances, each thread thin on its own, but together forming a picture they believed was unmistakable. At the center of that picture was Scott Peterson. Investigators reconstructed Christmas Eve not as Scott described it, but as they believed it actually unfolded. Their theory was stark. Laci was already dead or dying before Scott left the house that morning. Prosecutors alleged that Scott killed her at home, quietly, without a struggle loud enough to draw attention. They would later argue that the absence of chaos did not suggest innocence, but premeditation. According to prosecution, Scott wrapped Laci's body in a tarp or covering, maneuvered her into his truck, and drove nearly 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina. There, they said, he transferred her body into a small fishing boat and dumped her into the bay, weighted down with homemade concrete anchors designed to keep her submerged. The anchors became a critical detail. Investigators discovered Scott had recently mixed concrete at home. Only one anchor was ever found. Prosecutors argued the others had done exactly what they were designed to do, sink permanently. The location where Laci and Connor surfaced reinforced this theory. The remains emerged in the same general area Scott admitted to fishing months later, as tides and currents shifted. To the prosecution, the bay did not just hold bodies. It held corroboration. Then there was motive. Prosecutors painted Scott as a man desperate to escape responsibility. He was facing fatherhood, domestic routine, and financial pressure. At the same time, he was maintaining an affair and presenting himself to another woman as single, unattached, and free. Laci's pregnancy, they argued, represented not joy but confinement. The affair with Amber Fry was presented not as a moral judgment, but as psychological evidence. Recorded phone calls revealed Scott speaking about future plans, trips, and romance, sometimes while standing at public vigils for his missing wife. Prosecutors suggested this emotional detachment pointed to someone who already knew Laci would never return. They also highlighted Scott's behavior after the disappearance, his calm demeanor during interviews, his inconsistent statements about timelines, his focus on logistics rather than panic, his decision to sell Laci's car and discuss selling the house. None of these actions proved murder on their own, but prosecutors argued they revealed consciousness of guilt. The defense pushed back fiercely. They emphasized what the case lacked: no eyewitness to a murder, no confession, no murder weapon, no definitive cause of death. They suggested alternative theories: abduction, burglary gone wrong, unknown perpetrators. They argued the case was built on assumptions, not facts, and that Scott's affair made him an easy villain in the court of public opinion. But prosecutors countered with a chilling point: perfect crimes are rarely loud. They argued that Scott's greatest advantage was familiarity. He knew Laci, the house, the routines. He did not need violence in the conventional sense. He needed timing, control, and opportunity. By the time the evidence phase concluded, the jury was left with a question that would define the case. Was this a tragic coincidence built on suspicion and bias, or a carefully concealed murder committed by the person Laci trusted most? In November 2004, the verdict came back. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. The courtroom reaction was raw. Laci's family wept openly. Scott remained largely expressionless, absorbing the words that would define the rest of his life. The jury had not needed a weapon or a confession. They believed the totality of circumstances told a story too consistent to ignore. Weeks later, Scott was sentenced to death. Years would pass before that sentence was revisited. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned the death penalty, citing issues related to jury selection, not innocence. Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, where he remains today. For the legal system, the case was closed. But for the public, and for those who continue to question what really happened, closure never fully arrived, because some crimes do not end with a verdict. They linger, quietly, persistently, asking whether justice and truth always arrive together. A guilty verdict is supposed to be the end of the story. In the Laci Peterson case, it wasn't. Even after Scott Peterson was led away in handcuffs and later resentenced to life in prison without parole, the case refused to settle into certainty. Instead, it fractured, splitting public opinion into camps defined not by sympathy, but by doubt. Scott Peterson has always maintained his innocence from behind prison walls. He insists he did not kill his wife or unborn son. Over time, that insistence found allies. Legal advocates and innocence-focused organizations began re-examining the case, arguing that the prosecution's theory, while compelling, was built on interpretation rather than direct proof. They pointed to what they believed were missed or minimized details. Witnesses who claimed to have seen a pregnant woman walking a dog after Scott left the house. Reports of burglaries in the neighborhood around the same time. Questions about timelines, tidal patterns, and whether the bodies could have entered the bay from a different location altogether. To supporters of Scott Peterson, these unanswered questions represent reasonable doubt that was overshadowed by public outrage and media pressure. To critics, they are distractions, attempts to unravel a verdict that was reached by weighing the totality of evidence, not isolated facts. The debate intensified as documentaries revisited the case, each framing the story through a different lens. Some emphasized the emotional devastation suffered by Laci's family and the overwhelming circumstantial case against Scott. Others questioned whether a man could be condemned to life in prison without a single piece of direct forensic evidence tying him to the act of murder. And then there is the most uncomfortable truth of all. We will never hear Laci's voice. There was no final message, no last call, no eyewitness to her final moments. Whatever happened inside the house on Christmas Eve remains locked in silence, known only to the person or persons responsible. The water erased the physical story, leaving behind only fragments for the living to interpret. For Laci's family, the loss is permanent, unambiguous, and unbearable. They lost a daughter, a sister, a mother-to-be. Justice to them was served in a courtroom, but grief does not end with sentencing. For the public, the case endures because it forces an unsettling confrontation with human nature. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Can a crime be proven without being seen? And when certainty is built from patterns rather than proof, where does truth truly live? The murder of Laci Peterson is not just a story about guilt or innocence. It is a story about trust, deception, perception, and the terrifying possibility that the most dangerous secrets exist not in dark alleys, but inside ordinary homes. And perhaps that is why this case still grips us. Because even now, years later, one question still echoes louder than any verdict. What really happened to Laci Peterson on Christmas Eve? Share your thoughts, theories, and reflections in the comments. Do you believe justice was served? Or do unanswered questions still remain? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more in-depth true crime stories that explore not just what happened, but why.